Ignorant Gurus and Negative Enlightenment. It's quite a catchy title that will attract the attention of most people. I want to start by just saying that all gurus are ignorant, all of them, and they have to be necessarily forced to do that. And if you look at the way I spelled ignorant, is ignore an ant. So which means that I don't really mean that the gurus are ignorant. All gurus are ignorant. In the regular sense of the word, that they don't know things or they are unaware, that they are foolish. So ignorant has to be understood as something that has been ignored. It's not ignorance per se, but that's which has been ignored. And everybody is supposed to do that. Why? Because it is not possible to look at reality in a holistic way, that unless you are very, very conscious. Now, let me, without much ado, I want to go and talk to you what I really mean by the title, Ignorant Gurus and Negative Enlightenment. Ignorant gurus are those, let me define the term, who ignore a chunk of reality that needs to be kept, not just ignored. And that has to be related to the enlightenment. So first I have to define enlightenment, and then ignorant. That will make it very clear. And let me say something general so that it is easy for you to understand. Enlightenment is often understood being spiritual or realization of oneself, or realization of God, or realization of the self, other than the realization of the mundane life that we have been living. So an enlightened person, in other words, is one who is into God, or who is able to see the reality beyond the mundane reality. So what has happened here is we have juxtaposed enlightenment as something against our mundane life. So an enlightened person is someone who is not into the world, not a worldly person. In other words, the worldly person on the one hand, and then the enlightened person on the other hand. So in order to be spiritual, you have to leave the material world. That's why asceticism, renunciation, became the major focus for enlightenment, not only in the Eastern tradition but also in the Western tradition. That's why there is the necessity to create the tradition of monks and nuns and so forth in the Western Christian tradition. But here in the Eastern tradition, the gurus were celibates, ascetics, who have no assets, And the literature that has come to us, and also the tradition that has come to us, is the tradition of those people who represent enlightenment. Who are those people? These are the people who are ascetics, who have made a choice to put down material life, earthly life, and have chosen a life of penance, meditation, and containment of desires, etc. So you have to really, what are you going to lose here in order to get enlightenment from this tradition? You have to just be someone who is very different from ordinary people who lead a life of what is called in the Indian tradition a householder, who is married, who has children, and then who has to take care of a lot of other things. But whereas the enlightened person is a guru, a yogi who goes to the Himalayas and he doesn't have to take care of this. So that is, that tradition has continued. Let's, if you look at the Indian traditions, most gurus have never married or at least in the current day tradition. Although there are traditions, because in the Vedic traditions they were married people, the rishis were married and the siddhas were married, but then that is not the tradition that has continued. What has continued and then has become mainline is the ascetic tradition. That is true of the Buddhist monks as well. Now, this tradition has become the mainline one. So you follow this tradition. So what it requires is giving up your material life or worldly life, or your desire to dress up or eat good food. All these things are kind of outlawed, or severe restrictions are given for various reasons. Now, this split between materialism and spiritualism, which characterizes enlightenment, has to be looked at very carefully. The term, now I wanted to talk about the term, the ignorant gurus. So these gurus who represent just the ascetic tradition is what I call as the ignorant gurus. I call the people ignorant gurus not because they are ignorant per se, but they have ignored the material aspects of life, and also of the material mindset. Not just only material life as one lives it, but also the material state of mind. And when you ignore this mind, and when you ignore this material life, you are only representing a very limited and lopsided reality. I'll give you a very graphic example here. There is Buddha. The Buddha is an enlightened person. The term Buddha itself means one who is awakened to his own self. He never believed in a self, or awakened to consciousness, and in the process he has to give up his family, his wife, his son, his father and the kingdom, and then go to a different way of life. And if you have seen my earlier pictures prior to 2000, and I was dressed, like someone, like a guru who's representing that tradition, and that image will stand out from the image that I have today, although I have a little bit of hair growing now, but I don't have any intention to go back to the old, way of having a big beard and hair. Now, is it possible to have it both? And that has been my teaching. Why do we have to have both? Which means the material life as well as the spiritual life together. So when you look at this model, there are problems. The ignorant gurus, which are the gurus belonging to the ascetic tradition, of putting more emphasis on spirit, necessarily have to do what? To follow the life of renunciation and containment, because once you are involved in this world of mundane activity, it is very difficult to remain focused on yourself. This problem is discussed in the Bhagavad Gita, where Krishna and Arjuna talk about this problem. Because Arjuna wants to leave this world. He doesn't care for the kingdom, he doesn't care for wealth or anything. He said, I am very happy with whatever I have or whatever I don't have, but I am not going to kill people just to get wealth and my kingdom. And after all, the purpose of life is enlightenment. Then Krishna has to tell him, no, it's not that. Okay, that you have to do karma. You cannot escape karma. That's the main teaching of the Bhagavad Gita. He says that between inaction or non-action and action, Krishna says, it is better to act rather than not to act. Karma jyayo na akarmanaha. Between karma and akarma, it is karma that is preferable. Why? It is because he says that it is impossible for anyone to stay away from karma. You have to act. You necessarily have to act. Even breathing is an act. And breathing can be stopped. And that's another matter that cannot be done by most people, even by most gurus. It needs a different kind of practice, a very, very focused practice. Now, I wanted to do this video for one reason. What is that? Most people, I've been staying in India. I see a lot of foreigners coming here in search of enlightenment. And what do they get? They're not given the opportunity to understand what is enlightenment. So before you do anything, you have to ask the question, what is enlightenment? Is it enlightenment dressing up differently and then being a vegetarian or starting to do yoga and meditation. And what kind of meditation you are going to do? All these are very important. So what you need to do is to first ask the question that do you have to necessarily give up this life in order to be enlightened? Do you have to ignore this life in order to be enlightened? Can you have both? And this has been the question of almost everyone. Because there is, on the one hand, a natural attraction towards this world, towards the world of senses and sense pleasures that define, what pleasure and happiness is. So we really have to address this and question and look at it deeply, if at all it is possible, to be an ordinary person like anyone else or most people are, and still be enlightened. Do you have to sacrifice your worldly life? No. You can have both. But having said that, it is not easy. So I'm going to give you some thoughts and practices that you could do in order to have both. And if you, I am very convinced, only choose the traditional path of negation, of negating this world, you end up in what is called negative enlightenment. That's what I call a negative enlightenment. A negative enlightenment completely ignores the world of the senses. And I was just looking at some of the practices where you can create a vacant look or vacant eyes. You will be looking at the world, but you can pull your energy so that you won't be able to see it. And you can do this to your ears also. You can just pull the energy, because remember, the ears and the eyes are only instruments through which the information flows into the mind and the mind processes it. And when you disconnect, then you can do a lot of things. And why do you have to do that? Because you have to have consciousness, not to be polluted by input from the eyes, from the input from the ears. That's the reason why these practices are promoted, and which leads to negation. I'm not against this practice, but then it has to be done with full awareness that one has to come back and go into that level. So that is going to be the orientation, so that you are not losing this life in order to get enlightenment. And so in other words, my positive enlightenment is one where you can have both, and a very balanced and a holistic approach. So I will be doing a few videos on that. I don't know what the frequencies are, but this is going to be this is something that I have been forced to do after having lived particularly in Tiruvannamalai. I see a lot of people coming here and going to checking into ashrams and then fighting with their mind, whether it is and not knowing what is the purpose of enlightenment, and, or even to define enlightenment. All these things are going to be the way that the people should engage in order to, before they dedicate their life for enlightenment. God bless.